Hello and welcome back. News came to the attention of Doctor Who fans over the weekend that an alumni from the classic series of Doctor Who passed away early in August. We've just found out in the last week or so. His name is Christopher Hamilton Bidmead. Doctor Who fans will remember him as the script editor of Tom Baker's controversial and divisive final season. So let's remember Christopher Bidmead. Hello, welcome back. My name is Paul Mount. Yes, I like to do these tributes occasionally to well-known names in the genre, and I think that Christopher Bidmead deserves to be remembered because he made a fairly important contribution to Doctor Who in the late 1970s. Doctor Who had been hugely popular back in the 1970s. John Pertwee took over in 1970, of course, and steered the TARDIS for 5 years before stepping aside for Tom Baker, who took the show to new heights of popularity. His image as this eccentric, rebellious bohemian appealed to a young audience and students, and he very much inspired the Doctor Who fan movement, which survives to this day, for better or for worse. But by the late 1970s, Doctor Who was looking a little bit threadbare. Star Wars had come along a couple of years earlier and given the audience a taste of slightly more lavish and spectacular science fiction, despite the fact that Doctor Who was still telling intelligent, quite sophisticated stories. It looked like the poor relation, it has to be said. The late 1970s, the country was riven by recession, TV budgets were falling, production values were falling, and Doctor Who, towards the end of the 70s, was looking threadbare. In came a new producer, John Nathan Turner, taking over from Graham Williams, who had managed to keep the show afloat in times of financial crisis. But Nathan Turner felt that the show needed a new look, it needed a new direction, and it needed different types of stories. In came Christopher H Bidmead. Christopher Bidmead was born on the 18th of January 1941. He went to Sizewell Hall School, then to Highgate School, then he trained as an actor at RADA, the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts. After graduating in 1962, he played several roles on stage, screen and on radio. He had a role in Emergency Ward 10, a quite a popular 1960s medical soap opera. In the early 1970s, though, Bidmead had moved into script writing, and he worked for Thames Television on material for daytime soap operas like Harriet's Back in Town, which incidentally occasionally starred William Russell from the early days of Doctor Who, and a series called Rooms. He was a journalist, and he contributed articles to things like New Scientist because science was one of his great passions. He was a huge fan of home computing, which was a new phenomenon at around this time. In 1979, he found himself approached to take up the role of script editor of Doctor Who. He was actually recommended by former Doctor Who scriptwriter Robert Banks Stewart. Bidmead's approach to Doctor Who was slightly different. Being a scientist, or with scientific interest, he felt, as many did, that the show had become a little bit twee and whimsical over the last couple of years. Many attributed that to the influence of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy legend Douglas Adams, who had introduced a playful and fantasy-orientated atmosphere to the series, coupled with the fact that Tom Baker, who had now been in the role for about 6 years, had become extremely proprietorial about the character, and he was a formidable presence on set, and basically it was his way or no way. He had by now started playing the Doctor in a much looser and slapstick fashion. His first 3 seasons in the role were a distant memory. In those seasons he'd been cold and distant and unknowable. Now he was a bit more of a clown. He leaned much more into the comedy, which had been introduced into the series in 1977, following protests from clean-up campaigner Mary Whitehouse that the show had become too violent. He leaned into that very heavily, and he became much more comedic and playing to the audience, particularly playing to the children in the audience. With the show moving into the 1980s, Christopher Bidmead decided that the show needed an injection of science, and how he injected science into the series. Season 18 is a very odd one for Doctor Who because it's very, very different from not only its previous season, but most of its previous seasons. Nathan Turner had insisted that Baker tone down the comedy, so the scripts offered less opportunity for him to indulge himself. The Doctor was given a new silhouette. Gone was the slightly scruffy-looking scarf and hat and coat. There was a more streamlined burgundy look to his character. All this was contained within a selection of stories that had a much more hard science fiction background. None of us will forget the excitement of learning about tachyonics in season 18's opening story, The Leisure Hive, or the fun and excitement of learning about charged vacuum appointments when the Doctor and Romana found themselves plunging into e-space, and the thrills and spells of season finale Logopolis, which revolved around entropy creeping across the universe. We were a long way from Daleks and Cybermen in season 18 of Doctor Who. But that's what Bidmead wanted to do with the show. He wanted to give it a bit more steel and a bit more science. Doctor Who had never really been a science fiction show. It was very much a science fiction show whose science was of the pseudo-science variety, often bandied about in many science fiction shows, particularly American shows. Bidmead was very keen that Doctor Who should appear to have some sort of scientific spine to it. The result, unfortunately, was plunging ratings in the UK. The show was now pitted against the latest American glossy import, Buck Rogers in the 25th Century, which burned quite brightly before it was cancelled, but Doctor Who suffered because Buck Rogers reflected on the small screen the space opera style of Star Wars, and for a while that was more appealing to audiences. Doctor Who was on the back foot slightly, and season 18, whatever you may think of it, didn't really help bring the audience back to the show because the stories were a little bit dour, they were a little bit drab, they were a little bit serious and poker-faced. And that's partly the responsibility, I suppose, of Christopher Bidmead. Now, I am here to praise Christopher, not bury him now that he's left us. But I think that certainly from my perspective, I had certain problems with season 18 because it seemed that the balance had swung the other way. Where the show had become a little bit of a pantomime and quite comedic, certainly in the previous year or so, this was a massive swing in the other direction. The show was no longer featuring any of its iconic monsters. The Daleks and the Cybermen were long gone, it seemed, even though the Daleks had appeared slightly tattily in the previous season. But this was all about ideas. And there were some very good, interesting science fiction ideas in here, but I'm not entirely sure they fitted Doctor Who. And I think part of the problem with Christopher Bidmead's writing and script editing is that he didn't have a great feel for the humanity of characters. Tom Baker, having been stripped of the humour and the wit, looked miserable most of the time. Apparently he was unwell during a lot of the filming, and he came to the decision during the filming that perhaps it was time for him to move on, which I think is what John Nathan Turner really wanted, because he'd been in the role for 6 full seasons at the time. And I think the feeling was that he'd done all that he could in the series. So it was time for him to move on, and I think he was edged towards the door by this rather dour new look he was given, and the new stories that he was involved with, which didn't give him opportunities to do what he wanted to do, which was to have fun. So Bidmead was keen to commission stories that had heavier concepts in them, which dragged the series down a little bit. And he certainly wasn't particularly adept at writing naturalistic dialogue. Much of the dialogue in season 18, particularly from the regular characters, is quite stiff and awkward, and is very much a sense of people don't speak like that, particularly when we had some new companion characters introduced. The third story in the season introduced Adric, played by Matthew Waterhouse, mathematical genius, a teenage boy, intended to appeal to a teenage boy audience, but being an alien and a slightly sniffy, pompous one, didn't make him particularly appealing to the intended audience. The show then introduced Nyssa, played by Sarah Sutton, who was a princess from an alien planet, a sort of fairy princess. And in an attempt to reground the series again, we had Tegan, played by Janet Fielding, introduced in Logopolis, but there was a lack of real sense of believability about the way the characters spoke and the way they reacted to the extraordinary situations that they now found themselves in. It all felt very stiff, but that was what Christopher Bidmead brought to Doctor Who. Now, I'm not a huge fan of that particular era. I do feel that Doctor Who was in the middle of some massive change at the time, because it was. It was trying to set aside what it had been and find a new format and a new style that were carrying it through the 80s. I think Christopher Bidmead was instrumental in doing that, which is why I wanted to do a feature about him, because he was very much instrumental in moving the show away from the comedy and the bumbling around and the silly sound effects and cheap production values to something a bit glossier and a bit more thought-provoking based on his own interests in science. He only stayed with the show for a year. He did what he needed to do. Then he moved on, and I think Eric Saywood and another script editor, Anthony Root, took over for Peter Davison's first series. So I think that what Christopher Bidmead did was important, whether you think it was successful or not. It certainly wasn't in terms of ratings. Creatively, I think there's some good stuff in that season, but the science concepts are inarguably very dry and laboured and heavy, and they're not laced with that sort of sense of excitement and thrill that you really want from Doctor Who. I think Bidmead was more interested in exploring science rather than exploring storytelling. But he was responsible ultimately for Tom Baker's final serial, Logopolis, a 4-part story which was laboured with themes of mathematics and entropy, which saw the Doctor fighting against his old enemy, the Master, now played by Anthony Ainley, to save the universe itself. It was a fittingly dramatic end for Tom Baker's Doctor, but it didn't really feel in a way like Tom Baker's Doctor because he was, by this point, so different from the Tom Baker who had breezed into the series in 1974 and had enjoyed and had so much fun in the role. This seemed like a Tom Baker who knew that his time had come and gone. There's not a lot of joy in his performance in a lot of this series, but there is a lot of science and there's a lot of interesting ideas and concepts, but a lot of it doesn't feel much like Doctor Who. But it's a very important season because it does carry the show through that transitional period, and that's all because of Christopher Bidmead. Although Christopher Bidmead moved on from Doctor Who at the end of that season, it wasn't the end of his involvement with the show. He contributed his best serial, in my opinion, Frontios, for Peter Davison's final season in 1984. A really interesting story which did have a bit more grounded character work. Again, there's some interesting ideas in here and some great monsters, the Tractators, these sort of slug-like creatures which have a control over gravity, and they're making life difficult for human colonists on the planet Frontios in the far future. I really like this story. It's weird, it's a bit strange, but it gives Peter Davison a bit more to do than he'd done in many of his earlier stories. There's a little bit of humour in it here and there, and I think that Bidmead has a better grasp of character and dialogue and that sort of thing than he did in his earlier couple of stories. He did, of course, novelise his 3 Doctor Who stories. He novelised Logopolis, and he novelised Castrovalva, and he novelised Frontios. And with no disrespect at all to the genius that is Terrance Dicks, these books, although they're the usual sort of fairly slim length that you had for Doctor Who books at the time, the text is a little denser than it was with many of Terrance Dicks' books. And the writing is, I'm not going to say more accomplished, but more detailed and more in depth, because Bidmead is working from his own scripts. He knew what he wanted from those scripts and was able to turn them into novels that better reflected his vision for his stories. After leaving Doctor Who, I don't think Christopher Bidmead wrote for TV again, although I will be corrected on that if anybody knows better. But he did carry on writing because of his interest in science. He wrote lots of academic articles about computing. He became a bit of a computer journalist, writing for Personal Computer World and PC Plus and other computer magazines. And he would occasionally contribute to more speculative philosophical pieces for publications like New Scientist and Wired magazine. Even after all that, his contributions to Doctor Who continued. He had a number of unpublished or unmade stories which eventually found their way to Big Finish. One was called The Hollows of Time, which was submitted to the Doctor Who production team in 1984, which would see the Doctor losing some of his memories. Ultimately, Big Finish got their hands on it and released it in 2010. And there was another story called Pinacotheca, which was also known as The Last Adventure, a 4-part story which he submitted to the BBC in October 1986 for the Trial of a Time Lord season. So that's Christopher Bidmead's Doctor Who career and things he did outside the series, his work on TV before Doctor Who and his academic and computer-based work afterwards. I will also say he contributed to a lot of the extra material on Doctor Who DVDs and Blu-rays, and he came across as a very likeable, affable and quite knowledgeable gentleman. I don't think he was able to get that across into his scripts in terms of characters, but he was quite a bright and lively personality, and he always had something interesting to say about Doctor Who generally and his time on the series. I was surprised when I heard that he passed away, not because he passed away, because he was 84. And sometimes it's easy to forget that everybody's getting older, not just me. And you think back to his time on Doctor Who, well, he was 38 at the time he started working on Doctor Who, and that was 45 years ago. But for some reason, we tend to think that time stands still for people who work on our favourite show. So Christopher Bidmead is an important figure in Doctor Who. I don't think that what he achieved was massively accomplished, but it is important because he was involved in the show at a time of change when it had come to the end of an era and was trying to move forward into a new era. Logopolis is this atmospheric story which is dealing with concepts which are difficult to put across dramatically. Peter Davison's debut story, Castrovalva, which has some fascinating ideas about recursive occlusion and time folding back on itself. And then Frontios, which is just a great good old-fashioned monster story. He certainly had great ideas, and the problem was He wasn't always able to get them across in the most dramatic way on television. But it's an important contribution, and I think his passing needs to be marked because of the fact, like so many of the behind-the-scenes people who work on Doctor Who, the script editors and the script writers particularly, they're the ones who shape the show. Their contributions always need to be remembered. But we do remember Christopher Bidmead as he's passed. We send our thoughts out to his family and friends, of course, and we will remember his contribution to Doctor Who. Rest in peace, Christopher Hamilton Bidmead.